It's a story that starts with whispers, those quiet rumors that slither through small towns like venom, poisoning trust and unraveling lives. But this isn't idle gossip or baseless speculation. This is the kind of scandal that shatters reputations, exposes hypocrisy, and leaves scars so deep they can never heal. In Pine Ridge, a town clinging to its faded glory, where everyone knows your name and judges your sins, a bombshell detonated that no one saw coming. At the center of it all was Sheriff Calvin Hargrove, a man who had spent decades crafting an image of authority, integrity, and unshakable trust. To the people of Pine Ridge, he wasn't just the law, he was a symbol of safety, the person you turned to when the world felt unsafe. But beneath the badge lay secrets darker than anyone could have imagined. Secrets that would lead to forbidden desires, an unthinkable betrayal, and ultimately, a grisly murder that shook the town to its core. What happens when the protector becomes the predator? When the man sworn to uphold justice crosses a line so devastating it erases every boundary between right and wrong. This is the story of how power corrupts, silence protects, and truth demands a reckoning, even if the cost is blood. In any small town, the sheriff isn't just a law enforcement officer, they're an institution. In Pine Ridge, Sheriff Calvin Hargrove wasn't just respected, he was revered. A towering figure with silver-streaked hair and a voice that carried authority without needing volume, he embodied what people wanted to believe about justice. He'd served for 25 years, weathering scandals that toppled other officials and emerging unscathed every time. His reputation was bulletproof, or so everyone thought. But behind closed doors, Calvin harbored secrets too dangerous to acknowledge. To understand him fully, you have to go back to his beginnings. Born into a family of modest means, Calvin grew up idolizing the idea of order. His father worked as a mechanic, often coming home late at night covered in grease and frustration. Young Calvin vowed never to live paycheck to paycheck like his dad. Instead, he dreamed of power, not the kind wielded through fear, but through respect. By the time he graduated from the police academy, he had already mapped out his life. Rise through the ranks, earn the badge, and become the face of integrity in Pine Ridge. For decades, it seemed he'd succeeded. He cracked down on petty crimes, attended church socials, and shook hands at Little League games. People trusted him implicitly because he looked trustworthy. But trust is a fragile thing, easily shattered when tested. And Calvin's test came not from another politician or rival cop, but from someone far less powerful. Enter Tanya Brooks. Tanya Brooks was only 17 when her world collided with Calvin's. At first glance, she might have seemed like any other teenager in Pine Ridge, a bright smile, a quick wit, and dreams bigger than her surroundings could contain. But Tanya wasn't ordinary. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that belied her age, born from years of navigating life on the margins. Raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at the diner, Tanya learned early how to fend for herself. She babysat younger siblings, juggled schoolwork, and still found time to volunteer at the community center. Her teachers called her a diamond in the rough, predicting she'd leave Pine Ridge one day and make something extraordinary of her life. That dream, the one where she escaped Pine Ridge and built a future full of possibilities, was everything to Tanya. But dreams are fragile, too. And when Calvin Hargrove entered her orbit, those aspirations began to crack under the weight of reality. Their relationship didn't start dramatically. It began innocuously enough, with Calvin stopping by the community center during one of Tanya's volunteer shifts. He complimented her work ethic, asked about her plans after graduation, and offered vague promises of mentorship. To Tanya, this felt like validation. Here was someone important, a man whose approval mattered, taking an interest in her future. What she didn't realize was that Calvin saw an opportunity. Not to help her, but to exploit her vulnerability. The affair unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, their interactions were professional. Calvin offering advice, Tanya soaking it up like a sponge eager to learn. But over weeks, then months, boundaries blurred. Late-night conversations turned intimate. Offers of guidance morphed into gestures of affection. And before either of them fully understood what was happening, they crossed a line neither could uncross. To outsiders, their connection might have seemed improbable. Calvin was nearly 3 decades older than Tanya, a man entrenched in privilege and power. Tanya, meanwhile, was young, black, and struggling against systemic barriers she couldn't control. Yet their dynamic wasn't unusual in the context of abuse of power. Calvin held sway over her life in ways subtle yet undeniable. He controlled access to resources, connections, and opportunities she desperately needed. For Tanya, resisting him felt impossible, not because she didn't recognize the wrongness of their relationship, but because saying no meant risking everything she'd worked for. As the affair deepened, guilt gnawed at both of them, but differently. Calvin wrestled with paranoia, terrified of being discovered. Every knock at the door made him jump. Every sideways glance from a colleague sent his mind spiraling. Tanya, on the other hand, grappled with shame and confusion. Part of her knew this was wrong, but another part clung to the illusion that Calvin cared for her. That maybe, just maybe, he'd protect her from the fallout once the truth came out. Neither of them anticipated the bombshell waiting around the corner. It started with missed periods, fatigue, and nausea. At first, Tanya dismissed the symptoms as stress. Between juggling school, volunteering, and managing her complicated relationship with Calvin, exhaustion seemed inevitable. But denial only lasted so long. When she finally took a pregnancy test, and saw 2 pink lines staring back at her, her world tilted on its axis. Pregnancy brought clarity to Tanya's situation in ways nothing else had. Suddenly, the fantasy of Calvin caring for her evaporated. She realized the harsh truth. She was alone. Alone in carrying the consequences of their actions. Alone in facing a future derailed by circumstances beyond her control. And most terrifyingly, alone in confronting a man who now viewed her not as a partner but as a liability. When Tanya told Calvin about the baby, his reaction confirmed her worst fears. Gone was the charming mentor who promised to guide her toward success. In his place stood a calculating predator, coldly assessing the threat she posed to his carefully constructed image. "We need to handle this discreetly," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. "Handle it." As if she were a problem to solve rather than a person to care for. What happened next is where the story takes its darkest turn. Calvin's solution to the pregnancy wasn't one rooted in compassion or responsibility. It was ruthless, desperate, and ultimately deadly. But before we dive into the grisly details of the murder that followed, let's pause and reflect on how we got here. How did a man entrusted with protecting lives end up destroying one instead? And why did Tanya, a girl with so much potential, become entangled in a web she couldn't escape? Stick with me. This is where the tragedy truly begins. And remember, I'll be in the comments later, ready to hear your thoughts. Because stories like this aren't just about the past. They're about understanding the systems that enable abuse and the courage it takes to speak the unspeakable. The decision Calvin made after learning about Tanya's pregnancy wasn't one born of panic. It was calculated, methodical, and chillingly devoid of humanity. To him, the baby wasn't just an inconvenience. It was evidence, a living, breathing reminder of his betrayal. And evidence, as he well knew from decades in law enforcement, had to be eliminated. Tanya didn't see it coming. How could she? Despite the growing distance between them, part of her still clung to the hope that Calvin cared for her, even if only a little. So when he suggested meeting at an abandoned cabin on the outskirts of town, to talk privately, he said, she agreed without hesitation. She believed she was going to discuss their next steps, perhaps even plead for support. What awaited her instead was a nightmare. The details of what happened inside that cabin remain fragmented, pieced together later through forensic evidence and fragments of memory dredged up during the investigation. Witnesses recall seeing Calvin's patrol car parked near the cabin earlier that evening, though no one thought much of it at the time. Sheriff Hargrove working late? Nothing unusual there. But by morning, the scene painted a far darker picture. When authorities arrived, responding to reports of smoke rising from the woods, they found the charred remains of a fire, and within it, traces of something unspeakable. Burnt fabric, strands of hair, and blood spatter told a horrifying story. Someone had been killed here, and the perpetrator had tried desperately to erase all traces of their crime. But erasing a life isn't so simple, not when the victim leaves echoes behind. For days, Pine Ridge buzzed with rumors. A missing person report filed by Tanya's mother added fuel to the fire. "She hasn't come home," her mother sobbed during interviews. "This isn't like her. Something's wrong." Local gossip mills churned out theories ranging from teenage rebellion to abduction. No one suspected Calvin, not publicly, anyway. After all, why would anyone accuse the man sworn to protect them? Enter Detective Lydia Monroe, a seasoned investigator from the State Police Department brought in to assist with the case. Lydia wasn't from Pine Ridge, which meant she lacked the biases and blind spots that plagued locals. From the moment she stepped onto the scene, she noticed inconsistencies others missed. Why did Calvin volunteer information about Tanya's disappearance before being asked? Why did his alibi seem rehearsed, almost too perfect? And why did his demeanor shift so subtly whenever certain questions arose? Lydia began digging deeper, uncovering threads that led back to Calvin. Phone records showed frequent calls between him and Tanya, often late at night. Financial statements revealed unexplained withdrawals large enough to suggest hush money or bribes. Most damning of all, forensics linked fibers found at the cabin to Calvin's uniform jacket, a piece of evidence he claimed hadn't left his closet in weeks. As the net tightened around him, Calvin's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Friends who once praised him turned silent. Colleagues distanced themselves, unable or unwilling, to reconcile the man they knew with the monster emerging in headlines. Still, Calvin fought back, denying everything and portraying himself as a victim of circumstance. "I'm being framed," he insisted during press conferences. "Someone wants to destroy me." But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. Calvin Hargrove's trial became national news, drawing reporters, activists, and curious onlookers to the courthouse each day. For many, it wasn't just about guilt or innocence, it was about accountability. Could a man who'd spent decades enforcing laws truly escape justice for breaking them? Or would the system he served finally hold him responsible? The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence. DNA linking Calvin to the crime scene, witness testimonies corroborating Tanya's relationship with him, and expert analysis proving the fire at the cabin had been deliberately set. They argued that Calvin killed Tanya not in a fit of rage but as part of a premeditated plan to eliminate the threat she posed to his reputation. Defense attorneys countered by painting Tanya as manipulative, suggesting she fabricated the affair to extort Calvin. "My client is a respected public servant," they declared. He wouldn't throw away his career over a reckless teenager. It was a desperate attempt to sway jurors, but the strategy backfired. Instead of absolving Calvin, it highlighted the stark power imbalance between him and Tanya, a disparity impossible to ignore. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning a verdict, guilty on all counts. As the judge sentenced Calvin to life without parole, gasps echoed through the courtroom. Outside, crowds gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Tanya," and "Power abused is power lost." Yet even as cheers erupted, the mood remained somber. Justice, while served, couldn't undo the damage done. Tanya was gone, her dreams extinguished before they could fully take flight. Her family mourned not only her death but also the loss of trust, in institutions, in authority, in humanity itself. Years later, Pine Ridge still bears the scars of that tragedy. The community divided, some clinging to denial while others demanded change. Conversations about abuse of power, systemic racism, and the silencing of marginalized voices gained momentum, fueled by the outrage surrounding Tanya's case. For Detective Lydia Monroe, the case marked a turning point in her career. She went on to specialize in exposing corruption within law enforcement, becoming a vocal advocate for reform. "People think justice starts in courtrooms," she once said in an interview. But it begins long before that, with speaking up, refusing to look away, and demanding better. As for Calvin Hargrove, his legacy transformed overnight. Once celebrated as a pillar of integrity, he became a cautionary tale, a symbol of how unchecked power corrupts absolutely. Behind bars, he faded into obscurity, remembered not for the lives he supposedly saved but for the one he destroyed. Stories like Tanya's remind us that true crime isn't just about solving mysteries or assigning blame. It's about understanding the societal structures that enable abuse, the courage required to challenge those systems, and the resilience of those left behind. Tanya may not have survived to tell her own story, but her voice lives on through those fighting for justice in her name. Now, I leave you with this question. What role do we play in preventing tragedies like this? Are we bystanders, complicit in silence? Or are we advocates, willing to speak out, even when it's hard? Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you're moved by Tanya's story, share it. Talk about it. Keep her memory alive. And don't forget, I'll be in the comments, ready to engage with your thoughts, theories, and reflections. Together, let's ensure stories like this spark meaningful conversations and lasting change.